Welcome. I'm Bob Pinta at The Wharf. We'll get into that at some point. Uh, so I wanted to start making YouTube videos. Everybody that I've seen inspires the heck out of me. Matthias Wandel, and I mean, I could list off 20 or 30. Frank Howarth. They're wonderful, and I've learned so much that I figured I would start making YouTube videos. And I started something on the lathe, but all I have to record is the iPad, and trying to get it to prop up and clamp it to this and whatever was a huge pain. So what I decided was my first video would be make an iPad stand. So right here, all I'm doing is cutting 2x4s, dimensional lumber, into a base. So the two side pieces in the video now are what sits on the floor, and those are 1 foot long, and then the vertical piece is 3 feet long. When it's all done, I wanted it to be about 4.5 feet tall. So all I'm doing here is pre-drilling and screwing in, and at this point, it should look something like this. So now what I'm going to work on is the tilt feature. The height will be locked in at this point for how I'm building it, but the tilt is going to be adjustable. So what I did is I'm going to take a vertical piece of 2x4 and cut a groove out of it for the vertical support piece to settle into. So that's what I've done there, and then I'm going to drill a hole all the way through, and that'll be a pivot point. And the pivot point will be tightenable, if that's a word. And in order for it to pivot, I needed to cut that round, so I did that on the bandsaw. And at this point, I just drill through. I'm going to use all 1/4-inch bolts, threaded rods, nuts. That's what I use in all my projects, unless it really needs some strength. So that works out very well. So I couldn't get the depth to go all the way through, so I had to bring the bit out. Not exactly the safest thing, but it was fine, it worked. Here I'm enlarging the hole a little bit so that the head of the bolt will settle inside. So I test it, and the bolt goes in, and it works pretty well. It pivots nicely. Next, what I do is I put on a washer and a nut to tighten it down. This is my bin of nuts and bolts and whatever. And it does what it's supposed to do. It tightens it up, or at least that was the plan. When I tighten it up, I realize it's not tightening very much, and a big part of it, I think, was because the cut wasn't enough, so the wood wouldn't squeeze because it didn't have anywhere to go. So I go to the bandsaw and I cut that much higher. I'll come back in a second here. There it is, and so you can see I cut it much higher, so now it can actually squeeze in. So I put a washer in there because it was a little bit loose to start with. I wanted it to be more snug even when it's loose. So I put that on, and it stays where I put it, and at this point it should look something like that. So now what I did is I drew out what I thought the iPad holder would look like. I drew it out, and then I cut it out. All I did was I measured the height of the iPad, and that's how tall that track is. I guess it's a huge T-track, for lack of a better way to think about it. The bolt through what is the top of it is going to be tightenable, and that's what it'll squeeze down on the iPad. Now, my first thought is, wait, isn't that going to crack the iPad? So I took some vinyl tubing, and I cut a length of it, and I wanted it to sit just in the vinyl tubing. So I cut some sections of it, basically I cut it vertically in half, and it fits perfectly in the little groove that I made. And then I put another one up on top, and that's what the iPad actually slides into. And then the bolt on top, all it does is it pushes down a little bit on the vinyl tubing, and once I get a little bit of a resistance, I stop, and it works well. So now I'm going to mount the 1/4-20 nut into the bottom of that, and that's what it'll screw onto the base that I completed earlier. So once I got that mounted in there, I realized that the hole wasn't big enough. So once I got that hammered in, then it was time to put a bolt into the base. So I pre-drilled a hole, which I didn't show on camera, and then I threaded the bolt, or I put the bolt into the drill. So as I'm drilling, it's just screwing the bolt into it. And as I did that, I put super glue with it to kind of keep it glued in. Tightened it a little bit so that it only stuck out. I wanted it to stick out maybe 3/8 of an inch. Just cleaned a little bit of the squeeze out of the super glue, and there's that part of it. So at this point I wanted to make a couple of knobs because I didn't want to have wrenches and everything around to loosen and tighten. So I just cut a circle on the bandsaw, hammered in a nut. I have a disc sander that I made on my lathe that just to smooth it out a little bit, but any sandpaper would do, and it works very well. Now you still need a wrench on the head of the bolt, and I fix that later, where I just undo it, but we'll get to that. So that is what it looks like at this point. The base looks good. The base was a little bit wobbly, but at this point, that's what it should look like. So once I realized that the base was a little bit rickety side to side, I decided to add a cross brace onto it. But because of my haste early in the video, the pieces were sticking out. So on the bandsaw, I just cut them flush with the vertical piece so that the cross brace would fit. Oh, look at that craftsmanship. Yeah, buddy. So over on the chop saw, I just cut a 1 foot piece, and then I drew an arch, and on the bandsaw, cut the arch out. I wanted it to kind of have legs, so that if the garage floor wasn't totally flat, it would still sit and wouldn't rock back and forth as I'm trying to take a video. So I pre-drill and screw the base on. Here I think for the whole project I used 2.5-inch screws. If you zoom in you can see the 2.5-inch screws. That goes through the 2x4 and then has a 1-inch bite into the piece behind it. And now the base is nice and sturdy. I give it a little push-pull, and this is what it looks like that's what the base looks like in SketchUp. And then the last thing that I'm gonna talk about is the bolt that pushes down on the iPad. I wanted that to have a knob on it, so I just again cut a little circle on the bandsaw, and then I ran the bolt through it, and then let it pull the nut into the wood, and then it works really well. The last thing I did here is I super glued the bolt in place. Now off camera I screwed up and I super glued it right there without it being attached, and then realized that I would have to take the bolt out in order to get it in. So I very quickly removed it, put it in place, and then tightened it. Let it sit for a little while, and then put a little bit more super glue just so it really holds tight. And now that tightens up nicely. So this is what the final product looks like. There's the tipping point, the tilt, and then the iPad settles in a little bit more vertically. There we go. So there's the groove where the iPad slides in. I got to make sure I slide it in with the side that doesn't have buttons, and there's the dial that I was talking about, and that pushes down on the vinyl tubing, and just once it bites the iPad, it stops. There's what it should look like in SketchUp, and I hope you like it, and come back to my channel.